I'm very sure this is The View from Israel. With apologies, for almost a year, I was unable to bring you interviews and reports on the fate of Israel, on the fate of Jews, both in Israel and abroad on this channel. Basically, I was too caught up helping my wife get the treatment she needed for advancing cancer, leading tragically to my family and I in great distress as we were forced to witness and unable to prevent the painful death of my wife, mother, grandmother, and unbelievably, given a youthful and beautiful spirit, her great-grandson. As we were numb with pain with the passing, we were forced to run to shelters as the death cults that surround us continue to rain down death and destruction on us. And was it a coincidence that this was happening as we approached and sat down to commemorate Passover? Passover is a time where we Jews recall another period of death and oppression, when we Jews lost our freedom, lost control over our destiny, lost our lives at the hands of the Egyptians, to the point that only a holy death penalty was inflicted on those who oppressed us and made our lives unbearable. Only through that act of justice being rendered on those who oppressed us and killed us did we regain our freedom and our liberty. And strangely enough, in our modern times, it took another Passover, the Park Hotel, because I'm speaking to you from Netanya, where again, modern day Egyptians, if you like, sent out by Yasser Arafat, massacred people celebrating freedom, leaving 31 dead and 150 injured. And so we come to today, a period in which the death cults that surround us needs to be countered, needs to be brought to justice, real justice, a justice that matches the inordinacy of their crime, that one man pledged to become, in my opinion, a modern day Moses, to introduce a sentence heavy enough to refrain those of us who cannot be refrained from murdering us, namely the introduction of a death penalty on mass murdering terrorists. That man is my guest today. Maurice Hirsch, welcome to The View from Israel.
Good morning, Barry. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure. I would express a few reservations about being a Moses. I'm far from that type of a person.
I contradict you, but first, on a personal note, I really want to thank you on behalf of myself and my grieving family. I want to thank you for traveling in Israeli terms such a long distance to our Shiva house while we were mourning to give us comfort. You are a dear friend, not just a colleague, and I want to thank you for that as well. We were deeply moved and impressed when you walked into my home.
Really something that has to be done.
To our viewers, and to set the scene for our conversation, Maurice, as I said, for me is a modern-day Moses because he is the man that pioneered the movement into law of the death penalty for murdering terrorists, those that deliberately set out to kill Jews. And this is our modern-day plague, and I use that word deliberately, that has gone beyond our borders, and it struck down Jews in Australia, in France, in South Africa, Britain, even in the United States. So it's not just Israel that should consider the death penalty for those that kill for political and religious legions, but other countries as well. So, Maury, tell our viewers who you are, what lit the spark, what was professionally with you, and what lit the spark that set you out on this mission?
So, as you know, Barry, I served in the legal department in the Military Advocate General in the IDF for many years. During that period of time, I spent a lot of time dealing with terrorists. I spent a lot of time giving general legal advice as to how to fight terrorism. And that meant you had to research terrorism. You had to get ready to know terrorism, to understand the terrorism, what drives it, what are the different forces, in order to try and then come up with solutions as to how to deal with terrorism. I then spent many years also in the idea of prosecution for Judean Samaria and even for what was Gaza prior to the disengagement in 2005. That brought me to read the statements of hundreds, if not thousands, of these monstrous terrorist murderers who professed, firstly, their desire just to murder Jews, just for being Jews. Like it is the Nazis. For all intents and purposes, these are the modern day, not only Egyptians, but Nazis. And really their belief in the fact that Israel is a weak country, that Israel is a country that isn't capable really of holding these people in prison. When you stand in court with these people and they say, all I wanted to do was murder more Jews. That was Abdallah Barghouti, a terrorist. I would like to say a man, but it's someone who had lost all type of semblance of humanity, who was responsible for the deaths of tens and tens of people, finally convicted for the murder of 67 people. He stood up in court and said, it's a shame that you arrested me. I just want to carry on murdering Jews. And when you look at these people in the eyes and you say, well, what we're going to do now is we're going to send you to prison for the rest of your life because we don't have a death sentence, you know that you've fallen short. You know that you've met these people. They are the angels of death. They don't want to die, by the way, Barry. You have the suicide bombers who are committed to dying no matter what. But that's not them. They are a very, very small minority within that group. The large majority of terrorists don't want to die. They're not interested in dying. How do we know that? Even from just simple facts. When the IDF soldiers go to arrest them, they don't shoot it out until the end. They come out with their hands up held high, like Marwan Barghouti. If you remember the pictures of Marwan Barghouti being arrested in his tighty whities, coming out of his hiding place. This is something which terrorists who want to die don't do. They want to stay alive. They want to fight again. The Palestinians, as we learn, celebrate 50 different occasions where Israel has released terrorists for one reason or another. And all of these mass murderers have gone free. And so the mass murderers know that if they stay in prison for long enough, their compatriots will then go along and kidnap Israelis, kidnap hundreds of Israelis, as they did in the October 7 massacre, and then force Israel to release more terrorists. This is the story that they've learned already back from 1970, when Shmuel Rosenwasser was kidnapped on the northern border, and he was released in return for the release of a terrorist. And since then, it started small, but once the terrorists understood that Israeli society is so susceptible to blackmail, to emotional blackmail connected to the kidnap of Israelis, that they can really get anything come along, Gilad Shalit, and suddenly we're releasing 1,027 people, of them 450 murderers, mass murderers, in return for one soldier. The terrorists look on and they say, we're happy. We know what we're doing. They don't want to die on the one hand, and they know they'll be released on the other hand. This is something which is unacceptable. This is something which has to change. These terrorists have to understand there is a cost for their actions. There is a cost for murdering Jews, and it is not sitting in prison. It is not sitting in prison when the Palestinian Authority then pays them a salary, a reward for murdering Jews. So they murder Jews, they sit in prison, they get rich, they go out, they murder more Jews. This is not deterrence. And so the new law that comes along and says, and this is what I've been pushing for many, many years, and I have to say I'm not the only one in this. There have been many other people who've been pushing for the death sentence. As we saw in the vote in the Knesset, there were 62 members of the Knesset who voted in favor of the death sentence. This is something which is now a substantial movement in Israel. It was large before the October 7 massacre. It has grown since the October 7 massacre, without question. And this is something which is now going to be part of the Israeli legal system. And the goal is very simple. And this is also my answer to all of the critics and detractors. The goal is that this law never be used. We should never have to put anyone to death for murdering a Jew, because they just shouldn't murder Jews. If you are a critic of the law, it means that you either have this general, nice, fluffy idea of, well, we don't like the death sentence, or you actually accept and condone the fact that Palestinian terrorists will continue to murder Jews and that they should not be subject to the ultimate penalty for murdering Jews. They can murder Jews, but we the Jewish people, the Jewish country, cannot put them to death even after a judicial process. That is unacceptable hypocrisy. That is something which cannot stand, and something which had to and will change.
Raise a point here. Is the death penalty confined only to those who are killed? Because you mentioned Marwan Barghouti. I would even go back. If it was right to bring Adolf Eichmann from Argentina into an Israeli court and sentence him to death, why doesn't that apply to others? The point I'm making here, that Eichmann was obviously part of the Nazi killing machine, but Eichmann didn't physically kill anybody. He organized the killing machinery, just as Marwan Barghouti, for instance, organized and incited and others trained to go out and murder. And I would go further. I would go even to Yahya Sinwar, who we caught and we put him in prison, like you said, sitting comfortably in prison, studying, do what he wants, using messaging to carry on the incitement, and was released with a whole bunch of other mass murdering terrorists in return for Gilad Shalit, one captured Israeli soldier. Had we put Sinwar to death at that time, perhaps the 7th of October may not have happened. In other words, we released him because he was using our prison as a sort of an Airbnb. And the result of that was the murder of thousands of Israelis. And I would add, quite frankly, also Yasser Arafat, who the world bestowed with the Nobel Peace Prize. He never took off his uniform. He went to receive the Nobel Peace Prize wearing a uniform. In other words, he was showing his supporters his ultimate intention. The West were being naive and silly about this. He even wore his uniforms at the United Nations. He never relented on any of his desire to murder Jews. And he went out using this cute phrase, the Intifada, which was the word meaning the mass murder of Jews. So does your death sentence apply only to those who've actually we managed to capture, who physically killed Jews, or is it for the organizers, the operators, the inciters, the organizers of the people who send out others to do the killing?
So we have to understand, Barry, that based on Israeli law, it needs, in order to understand the wider picture, we need to understand that the new law imposes the death sentence for murders that were carried out as an act of terrorism. It doesn't apply only to Palestinians or solely to Palestinians, as many people are arguing. This is a racist law because it only applies to Palestinians. The bad news is it doesn't. Or the good news is that it doesn't apply only to Palestinians. It applies to every single person who comes to murder Jews simply for being Jews. It would apply to people like Stephen Smirk, if you remember the name, the German who was recruited by Hezbollah and then sent to Israel to carry out terrorist attacks. It would apply to people like Kozo Yokomoto, if you also remember that name, the Japanese terrorist who landed in Israel and then shot up the Lod airport, murdering mostly Christians from Puerto Rico. It would apply to people like Samir Kuntar, the Lebanese monster who infiltrated Israel and then murdered an entire family, crushing a baby's skull with rocks. These are all the people who would be subject to the death sentence. And in answer to your question, Barry, based on Israeli law, no, it is not. Would not be restricted only to the person who actually pulled the trigger. Obviously, that would be not serving the point of deterrence. It would apply to all of those people who organized the bombs, who would then blow up. who armed the terrorists who would go and shoot up restaurants and airports. It would apply to all of those people who were involved in the process of carrying out a terrorist attack, which is sometimes a lot of people. You need financiers and you need bomb makers and you need people who are going to just ferry the terrorists and the suicide bombers from point A to point B. All of these people would potentially be part of this new death sentence. Instead of getting life sentences, they would be sentenced to death because, again, what's needed to deter them, they want to live. They want to live another day to murder more Jews. And we're telling them, friends, you've lost the plot. You will not be coming out. This isn't a passageway. This isn't an Airbnb. This is going to be a final destination, not a passageway.
Now, you told me in an earlier conversation, private conversation between us, that in fact, over here, the death sentence over here goes back to the British in 1945, I think, and also even Jordan in 1960. So to say that we through your initiative, we've certainly reinvented the death sentence, it's not true. It goes back, correct?
Yeah, it's certainly not true. Israel had the death sentence before the new law passed. It had the death sentence based on the security regulations from 1945. It had the death sentence even from Israel's regular penal code from 1977, where there are a number of offenses which carry the death sentence if carried out in certain circumstances. That was the death sentence that was on the books on October 7, 2023. That is the same death sentence which will be applied, and let there be no mistakes. That will be the death sentence that will be applied to the participants in the October 7 massacre that Israel arrested on the day or soon thereafter. And there are an estimated hundreds of these people in our prisons who participated in the murder, the rape, the torture, the butchering, the decapitation of bodies. These are the monsters who are going to stand trial soon. That's another project that I'm working on, the whole idea of the prosecution of the October 7 participants. And they will be subject to the death sentence because it was already on the law books before the new law passed. And that is critical to understand.
Maurice, with your permission, I want to remind our viewers and rebut something that I heard from one of the critics saying that Israel is like the only country now having the death sentence, and I want to respond to that. I'll give several examples. In the research that I did in advance of my talking to you, I discovered that in countries like Japan and India, for example, rape is punishable by the death sentence. And other countries include drug trafficking as punishable by death. And one of the countries with the largest number of death penalty cases is one of Saudi Arabia. And also some of our Abraham Accord countries like the UAE and Bahrain also included in the list, as is Singapore. In fact, 192 United Nations countries have capital punishment on their law books. So tell me, how does this law apply to the Nukba terrorists who committed horrendous atrocities, including mass rapes, torture, and the gruesome killing of young girls on the 7th of October, and still sit in Israeli prisons?
So you're right, Barry. There are a number of different countries in the world that do have the death sentence, and singling out Israel alone for passing legislation to forward the death sentence for murderers of Jews and for those who wantonly murder Jews is something which is so hypocritical in and of itself. As I explained before, the new law itself will not be applied to the Nukba terrorists. The new law only applies going forward, and with new events, with new acts of terror where people rise up and murder Jews. For the Nukba terrorists, there is already an entire legal structure that already exists. They will be put on trial. The discussions are ongoing now, but it looks like they'll be put on trial in military courts that will be run by civilian judges, and they will be subject to offences like aiding the enemy in time of war, which is an offence from Israel's penal code from 1977. That's an offence which carries the death sentence, and they will be subject to that death sentence. And the wide understanding, at least in Israel, is that there is substantial support for that movement. If you saw the law, or the recent law, the change of the law with the death sentence only being passed by 62 members of the Knesset, I believe that the law that will deal with the Nukhba terrorists will be very, very, very much more consensual. It's being pushed forward by both the coalition and the opposition in cooperation, in the understanding that this was a national event that needed to have a national response and a joint response. And the result will be, I believe, prosecutions, convictions, and the death sentence. Possibly we will see not a small amount of people being sentenced to death for their participation in the October 7 massacre.
I'd like you also to answer a number of objections to the death penalty. One person wrote that complaining that it's racist, that it applies only against Palestinians and not against Jews. And he quotes the example, for instance, of Yigal Amir, who killed an Israeli prime minister, Yitzhak Rabin. This he claimed was an equally egregious murder against the country by killing its elected leader. And he also referred to what he calls as Jewish settlers taking the law in their own hands by murdering local Arabs. He says if it's a terrorist, it should apply equally in cases like this. What's your explanation? What's your answer to that?
So firstly, I'll give you a few answers. The law itself does not mention Palestinians. It doesn't talk about Palestinians. So if you've already made that leap to say that it applies only to Palestinians, the problem is with you and not with us. You have assumed that Palestinians will continue rising up and murdering Jews, and therefore will face a potential death sentence. That problem is yours and not mine. That makes you a supporter of Palestinian terrorism and not me a racist, firstly. Secondly, the law applies, as I explained before, not only to Palestinians, it applies to everyone who rises up to wantonly murder people in Israel as an act of terrorism, as part of that goal of destroying the state of Israel. It will apply to all different types of people. It can apply to Stephen Smirk as well. He's not Palestinian, wasn't Palestinian, and probably will never be Palestinian. So that argument in and of itself also holds no water whatsoever. Thirdly, the goal of the law is deterrence. The goal of the law is to make sure that the people who need to be deterred are actually deterred. And that is really the crux of the issue. All of these detractors can possibly name extensively all 5 Jewish terrorists that have murdered Palestinians, and I don't make light of that. It is despicable. It is unacceptable. You cannot defend terrorism in any way, shape, or form. But all of these names are so familiar to everyone because the occurrence is so few and far between. People know about Yigal Amir, maybe about Baruch Goldstein, about Ami Popper. They know the names because they are so different from the rest of Israeli society, because Israeli society spews them out. They are outcasts. They are not acceptable in Israeli society. And therefore, the need for deterrence is not towards the Jewish population. It's towards the terrorist population, whether they be Palestinians or foreigners, coming to murder Jews and trying to destroy the Jewish people and to destroy the Jewish country. That is the need that is here. It has nothing to do with race, ethnicity, or anything else. It's to defend the Jewish people, yes, but not against one specific race group or other people. Whoever comes to destroy the Jewish people should know that they will be subject to this law. And if you have a Swede who decides to get up and come and murder Jews, he will be subject to this law. If you have an Australian who comes to murder Jews, they will be subject to this law as well. A European, and I give these examples because unfortunately they have all come up. And so they should all know that whether or not you are a Palestinian, you will be subject to the death sentence in the Jewish country when you come to murder Jews for the purpose of destroying the homeland of the Jewish people, for destroying the state of Israel.
Maurice, explain to me why Israel, in this case, has a two-court system, apparently. One in Israel, which I believe is a civil court, the other one in Judea and Samaria, which might be a military court. Why the difference in status and location between Israel and Judea and Samaria?
So I'll try and make a very long subject very, very short. As we know, in the War of Independence ended in 1949 with the armistice agreements. That would then become what's known as the Green Line, drawn in 1949. The Arabs will demand that that never become a border. And then jump forward 20 years, the Arabs, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, all try to again annihilate the Jewish state. Israel wins, and Israel takes control, amongst other things, of Judea and Samaria. The government then makes the decision that we are not going to permanently incorporate Judea and Samaria into the rest of Israel. The same was the decision with Gaza, rather that we would hold them under military rule. And therefore, in areas as international law can sometimes provide an idea of how you, even if they don't necessarily apply to the region, how you would then administer areas like that. So if you take, for example, Article 64, 66 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, provide that in areas such as Judea and Samaria, where you to consider them occupied territories, the occupying power is required to set up non-political military courts. So you have military courts in Judea and Samaria. That's really connected us for the last 58 years, 59 years since 1967. So you have military courts there, whereas within Israel, within the Green Line, you have civilian courts. The question, Barry, that needs to be asked really is, well, what does it matter? So one's called a military court and one's called a civilian court. Are the substantial rights that are given in those courts any difference? Both courts have the suspects can only be arrested if there is a concrete suspicion. In both systems, you have the right to avoid self-incrimination, the right to remain silent, the right to consult with a lawyer, the right to be represented by a lawyer during trial, the right to confront your accusers, the right to receive all of the investigative materials. So when you're talking about substantive law and what's called in legal terms due process, there is no difference between the military court system and the civilian court system. And those people who criticize the military court system really are criticizing Israel's civilian court system, which generally maintains an exceptionally high standard and is generally held in quite a good esteem. When you take, for example, the rules of evidence, there's a simple provision in the law in Judea and Samaria for the military courts that says the laws of evidence that are in force in Israel are the laws of evidence that will be applied in the military court. So when you talk about, well, in the military courts, you can submit secret evidence. That's just a lie. It's just garbage. It's people who have no clue whatsoever what they're talking about, spouting off at the mouth about something which really is simply not true. But it sounds good because you can attack Israel. It has no validity whatsoever.
Well, the bill that was passed by the Israeli Knesset, there has been talk that perhaps the Israel Supreme Court may even strike down the bill on the basis of equality under the law. Do you think this could actually happen?
So it's very hard to tell what Israel's Supreme Court will do. Israel has, unfortunately, a very, very activist court that has taken for itself the jurisdiction to strike down laws, declaring them as unconstitutional, even though Israel doesn't have a constitution. So if you're defining something as unconstitutional, you should have a constitution to first then say, well, this is the provision of the constitution and this is the breach of the constitution. But we don't have that. And Israel's Supreme Court has basically invented its own constitution and then adjudicates laws based on that constitution that we never have had in the past and probably won't have in the future. So it's hard to tell. I have to say there are a number of provisions within the new law. The new law applies to both Israel within the Green Line and to the military courts. I think there are some provisions of the law which are possibly a little bit on the edge of something which really could have been changed within the legislation itself. But again, it was more of a judgment call, and it's hard to say whether the courts will go one way or another. If they do intervene, I would imagine that they will look specifically at those provisions. There are two specific provisions that I'm talking about. The first provision says that even if the terrorist convicted and sentenced to death does appeal, the appeal will only apply to the conviction itself and not to the sentence. That is a restriction of the right of appeal. It's not something which is necessarily to do with the death sentence itself, but rather a more wide principle of a right of appeal. Should you have a right of appeal? International law, by the way, Barry, the Fourth Geneva Convention doesn't even require the existence of a court of appeals. Israel's had one nonetheless since 1989. And so the question will be, in that situation where you don't necessarily need a right of appeal, but you have a right of appeal, but you can only appeal a partial part of the decision, is that part of what would the court would see unconstitutional based on our unwritten and undisclosed constitution? The second part would be the ability to request any type of clemency or commutation of the sentence. This is something which the law was very clear about regarding Judea and Samaria, that there will be no option to give clemency. This is something which potentially is difficult for the law itself in Judea and Samaria, but when seen together with other provisions in Israeli law that would possibly provide other outs on that subject, then you understand that this isn't really the big monster that it's being made out to be. But the Supreme Court could, as it often does, view the situation in a very, very narrow approach, and then apply our non-binding, unwritten constitution and say that those provisions are unconstitutional and in breach of international law, which I don't think it's a breach of either of them. But that's something that remains to be seen as to how the court will move forward. I do believe that the court will show restraint in discussing the general subject of the death sentence. I don't think that they are, even our activist judges, are stupid enough to drag themselves into this discussion of the death sentence in the knowledge that there are hundreds of potential Nukhba terrorists arrested on the 7th of October, who Israel, the whole institution and the country, supports, given their conviction for murder, rape, torture, butchery, supports their final judicial execution. So I don't think the courts will be unwise, possibly saying stupid isn't the right word, unwise enough to drag themselves into that wider discussion.
And so taking it one step further, then assuming that, as you said, that some terrorist has been put on trial, has been found guilty, he has the right of appeal, as you say. This obviously will come down to the Supreme Court, but even if the Supreme Court would support the death penalty, am I right in saying that this mass murdering terrorist has another line and that rests with the president of the state of Israel, who could give a presidential pardon.
Yeah, for the terrorists who will be prosecuted within within the civilian courts in Israel, there is always the presidential pardon. It always remains, excuse me, it always remains an option. Obviously, no one is touching the almost holy rights of the president of the state of Israel, as he's held since the state was created. So that's always going to be a line that's there. There are other provisions. I won't get into the weeds with all of the details on that, but it is something which could be a possibility that going forward, and it's something that does need to be taken into consideration as to what will happen. Even there, the idea of limiting the ability to give any type of commutation of sentence wasn't there to show an evil intent, but rather to avoid an evil intent. What do I mean? If you have a terrorist convicted and is now on death row, the terrorist will possibly want to have this ability to kidnap Israelis and then to use them as bargaining chips, to dehumanize them as they did on October 7, and use them as leverage against Israel in order to release the terrorists. The idea of the law was to say, forget that. It doesn't, once the terrorists have murdered and they're sentenced to death, there is no one who is going to be subject to your blackmail. There's no one who's going to be subject to your corruption. Once he is arrested and convicted and sentenced, he will be put to death. And that is an important message going forward, because it means that you're really neutralizing this drive to kidnap people in order to force Israel to release. If there's no one who has the right to release the terrorists or even commute their sentence, then it's pointless then kidnapping more Israelis. So that was really the driving force behind those provisions. Obviously, it has unfortunately loopholes, which meant that it isn't airtight from that point of view. But there are still a number of provisions which would potentially allow for the release of terrorists, even those sentenced to death.
If we come down to this situation, you're mentioning the Nukba terrorists, and not only the Nukba terrorists, there are other murderers in our jails, and I want to finish off by you giving, from your experience, the amount of money that these terrorists are receiving via the Palestinian Authority, and beyond that, viewers. Most of our viewers, Maurice, are watching us not from Israel, but from a lot of the Western countries, from Australia through Europe and to the United States. Most of these countries give funding for the Palestinian Authority, which, as you mentioned a little bit earlier on, gets siphoned off into what they call, I suppose, a welfare system for the murdering terrorists. Can you give our viewers some idea of the compensation, the rewards, the amount of money that these murdering terrorists accumulate while they're sitting in Israeli prison?
So Barry, I think I will address that immediately, but I think it's important to give also your viewers a bit of an understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about terrorism. Right? Most people see terrorism as this really abstract idea in the Scandinavian countries that have been so vocal in criticizing Israel, the European countries. Let's put it in context. In 2025 alone, 24 Jews were murdered simply for being Jews. Simply for being Jews. And if you remember the attack on the bus in Jerusalem, a terrorist gets on a bus and shoots up everywhere. These are things that you don't see in other countries. 421 people injured, 56 orphans created just last year, 14 widowers. You're talking about scales of terrorism that the Western world, that is so critical of Israel, doesn't understand. And now to your question, What is driving that terrorism? What is driving that terrorism is the Palestinian Authority. It's the incitement to terrorism. It's the education to terrorism. And finally, it's the reward of terrorism. Every single terrorist that murders Jews, every single terrorist that participates in terror, no matter what, and gets caught by Israel, receives a salary. This isn't, and I don't use that word salary lightly. This is their definition in their laws. Receives a salary. Who receives a salary, Barry? An employee. So the Palestinian Authority sees every single one of the terrorists as their employee and pays them a salary. Similar to every normal employee in every country, a government employee, after a certain amount of time, your salary goes up. So after 3 years, based on the Palestinian Authority's pay scale for terrorists, your salary goes up. After 5 years in prison, it goes up again. After 10 years, it goes up again. You see this scale reaching up to 12,000 shekel, the salary that's paid to a minister in the government in the PA, and a terrorist murderer are receiving the same salary. This is the esteem in which they hold the terrorists. They spend on this hundreds of millions of dollars every single year, paying these rewards to terrorists, to murderers. It doesn't matter whether you're from Hamas, whether you're from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, whether you're from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, every terrorist, equal terms, you get paid by the Palestinian Authority. Now, you have bodies like the European Union who understand the fundamental evil of rewarding terrorists for their participation in terrorism, for rewarding terrorists for murdering Jews. Now, let's put this into context, Barry. Whilst the Nazis did pay ad hoc rewards for people who gave up Jews during the Holocaust, they never had an institutionalized, entrenched in law policy of rewarding people for murdering Jews. The Palestinian Authority, thanks to Mahmoud Abbas, the so-called moderate, has that policy, and every single terrorist gets paid a reward. So the European Union says, you know what? This is evil. We are not going to pay any money to the general budget of the Palestinian Authority because that money could potentially be used for paying salaries to terrorists and to terrorist murderers. The Europeans understand that that is bad. So what they say we're going to do, we're only going to pay the salaries of the teachers. Well, congratulations to you. So you're only going to pay the salaries of the people who teach the children that they should sacrifice themselves and go and murder Jews. That's not an alternative. Do you not understand that money is fungible? If you take on the burden of paying the salaries of the teachers teaching the children to murder Jews, then you're freeing the Palestinian Authority to use its own money to pay salaries to the people who actually murder Jews. The European Union is probably one of the most hypocritical institutions. They are up in arms against the death sentence. Where were they for the last 15 years when they knew that the Palestinian Authority was rewarding terrorists for murdering Jews? Did they sanction the Palestinian Authority? Did they threaten to sanction the Palestinian Authority? Did they cut off all funding to the Palestinian Authority until they stopped paying salaries to reward terrorists for murdering Jews? Absolutely not. They knew, they heard, they watched on, and like Hitler's willing henchmen, they said nothing. Now, when the Jews have the audacity to come along and try and defend themselves, to say that it's not okay to murder Jews, and when you come and murder Jews, you will be put to death, suddenly the European Union has arisen. The sleeping tiger has suddenly woken, and now they have a problem with the Jews. Where were you for the last 15 years? Where were you in 2004 when Mahmoud Abbas passed the pay for slay into legislation in the Palestinian Authority? You knew, You saw, you funded, you said, oh, we have a problem funding that particular thing, but we're going to fund everything else. There was no criticism. There were no demands. There were no threats of sanctions. There were no threats of cutting off ties. The opposite. The European Union entered into multiple multi-year programs to support and empower the Palestinian Authority. Now, when the Jews want to defend themselves against the terrorists that they, the European Union, have created together with the Palestinian Authority, suddenly they have a problem. You are hypocrites. For some of you, you are no different than the Nazis. That would be my message to the Europeans.
Morris, the problem with particularly the Europeans, and may I add also Australia as well, is they have been catering for decades to the anti-Semites, supporting them, allowing them the free speech to say and gather, for instance, as they did outside the Sydney Opera House on the 8th of October, Allah Akbar, kill the Jews. They ended up doing this. Australia, Bondi Beach. The problem, Morris, is they have enabled the killers and the people who can be incited to murdering Jews into their own countries, and they're doing it for votes. I'd hate to be cynical, but this is the basic truth of what's going on, particularly in Europe and in Australia. And this sickness is spreading. I think we have no choice but to take the law, literally the law, in our own hands and put an end to this. And I want to thank you and you viewers. You can now understand after our conversation with Morris that Morris, to me, is a modern day Moses, because this is the only way that we in Israel can quench a death cult. This is Barry Shaw, The View from Israel.